I never imagined I would be choosing a casket for my son. The polished mahogany seemed too formal, too final for someone so young, so full of life just days ago. My surviving son, Marcus, stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder, both of us trying to be strong for each other while falling apart inside. The funeral director spoke in hushed tones about arrangements and proceedings, but his words floated past me like distant echoes. All I could focus on was the weight of my badge in my pocket, Attorney General of the state, a position of power that meant absolutely nothing in the face of this loss. "Dad," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "Michael would have liked this one." He gestured to the casket I had been staring at without really seeing. "Remember how he always said everything should be classic, timeless?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Michael and Marcus, just 11 months apart, had been inseparable their entire lives, twins in spirit if not in birth. The meningitis had come so suddenly, so violently, taking Michael from diagnosed to gone in just 36 hours. The hospital staff had done everything possible, but sometimes everything is not enough. "Yes, he would have approved," I managed to say, placing my hand over Marcus's. At 23, both my boys had been at the beginning of their adult lives. Michael had just finished law school, following in my footsteps. Marcus was completing his master's in education. Now one future was extinguished and the other shadowed by grief. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of phone calls, visitors, and arrangements. My colleagues from the Attorney General's office offered support, handling my caseload, bringing food, providing whatever comfort they could. But comfort was in short supply. Each time the doorbell rang, I watched Marcus flinch, as though expecting his brother to walk through the door announcing it had all been some terrible mistake. On the morning of the burial, I stood in Michael's room, straightening his framed law school diploma. "I am so proud of you, son," I whispered to the empty room. "I will always be proud." I touched the glass over his smiling graduation photo before closing the door quietly behind me. The drive to the cemetery was silent. Marcus stared out the window, occasionally wiping his eyes with his sleeve despite the handkerchief I had pressed into his hand earlier. I focused on the road, on the simple act of driving, because thinking beyond the next turn felt impossible. As we approached the cemetery gates, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked near our family plot, a white SUV with a parking decal for Oak Ridge Estates, the upscale neighborhood that bordered the historic cemetery. Something about it seemed out of place, but I dismissed the thought. Today was about Michael, about saying our final goodbye. Nothing else mattered. The cemetery was beautiful that day, cruelly so. Spring flowers bloomed along the pathways, and birds called from the ancient oaks that dotted the grounds. Our family and friends gathered around the grave site, their faces masks of sympathy and discomfort. No one knows quite how to act around someone who has lost a child. I did not blame them. Until recently, I would not have known either. The minister began speaking, his words about life eternal and God's plan washing over me without penetration. I focused instead on the polished casket, on the reality that my son, my brilliant, kind-hearted son, was inside it. Marcus stood beside me, trembling slightly despite the mild weather. About halfway through the service, I felt Marcus stiffen beside me. He leaned in close. "Dad, I need a minute," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "I cannot. I need to breathe." I squeezed his arm in understanding. "Of course, son, take your time." Marcus nodded gratefully and stepped away from the gathering, moving toward a large oak tree about 30 yards from the grave site. I watched as he leaned against the trunk, his shoulders heaving with silent sobs. My heart broke anew seeing him there, alone with his grief. I considered going to him, but thought perhaps he needed this moment of private farewell to his brother. That was when I noticed a woman emerging from the white SUV I had seen earlier. She was perhaps in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a crisp pantsuit despite the casual neighborhood setting, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. She moved with purpose, her eyes fixed on Marcus as she strode across the cemetery grounds. At first, I thought perhaps she was a late-arriving mourner, though I did not recognize her. But something in her rigid posture set off warning bells in my mind. I watched with growing concern as she approached my grieving son. Even from a distance, I could see her expression was not one of sympathy but of annoyance. She gestured emphatically at Marcus, who looked up in confusion, clearly struggling to comprehend why this stranger was addressing him at such a moment. The minister's voice faded from my awareness as I strained to hear what was happening, but they were too far away. Marcus shook his head and turned slightly away from the woman, wiping his eyes. Rather than respecting his obvious distress, she stepped directly in front of him, pointing at the ground and then at the tree. I could see Marcus's expression shift from grief to bewilderment. I excused myself quietly from the service and began walking toward them, trying not to draw attention from the other mourners. As I approached, the woman's voice came into range. "I do not care what your situation is, young man. This area is Oak Ridge Estate's property, and you are trespassing." Her voice carried the artificial sweetness of someone used to getting their way through a veneer of politeness. Marcus looked utterly lost. "Ma'am, this is a cemetery. My brother. We are burying my brother today." His voice broke on the last words. The woman crossed her arms. "I am Sandra Winters, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. This tree and the land extending 15 feet from it belong to our community, not the cemetery. We have had issues with cemetery visitors using our property and leaving trash. I am going to have to ask you to step away immediately." I reached them just as Marcus, overwhelmed, responded, "Please, I just needed a moment alone. The service is almost over." "Do you see this line?" She pointed to an imaginary boundary on the ground. "Everything past this is HOA property. We paid good money for our homes, and we do not need cemetery people loitering on our grounds. It lowers property values." "Cemetery people?" I said as I joined them. "My son is not loitering. He is grieving at his brother's funeral." Sandra Winters turned to me with an expression of practiced condescension. "And you are?" "I am his father," I replied simply, placing my arm around Marcus's shoulders. "And we are in the middle of burying my other son right over there." I gestured toward the gathering by the grave. "That is not my concern," she replied coldly. "Rules are rules, and our HOA bylaws clearly state that non-residents are not permitted on HOA grounds. If you do not remove yourselves from this area immediately, I will be forced to call the police for trespassing." Marcus tensed under my arm. "Dad, let us just go back to the service, please." But something in me, perhaps the accumulated weight of the past week's helplessness, perhaps the sheer audacity of this woman's intrusion on our most vulnerable moment, refused to yield. "This is cemetery property," I stated firmly. "It has been part of Riverside Cemetery since 1892, long before your development existed." Sandra Winters pulled out her phone, tapping the screen with manicured nails. "I have the property maps right here, and I am telling you that this section was deeded to Oak Ridge during development. Now, I am trying to be reasonable, but if you insist on arguing, I will simply call the authorities." Marcus tugged at my sleeve. "Dad, please, this is not what today should be about. Michael would not want this." He was right, of course. This pettiness had no place in our day of mourning. I was about to concede, to lead Marcus back to the gravesite, when Sandra Winters made her final mistake. "Some people just have no respect for rules or property," she said loudly, already dialing her phone. "This is exactly why we need strict enforcement. Yes, hello? This is Sandra Winters from Oak Ridge Estates. I need to report trespassers on our property. Yes, at the border with Riverside Cemetery. They are refusing to leave after being informed they are on private property." I watched in disbelief as this woman, this stranger, called the police on my son at his brother's funeral. The service had paused, the minister and mourners now watching the scene unfold with confusion. Marcus had gone pale, his eyes darting between the continuing funeral and this unexpected confrontation. "They will be here shortly," Sandra announced with satisfaction after ending her call. "You can explain yourselves to them?" She stepped back, crossing her arms in triumph, apparently planning to stand guard until authorities arrived. I guided Marcus back toward the funeral. "Let us continue saying goodbye to Michael," I said quietly. "That is what matters today." As we rejoined the service, I could feel the questioning glances, but focused on the minister's words as he concluded the ceremony. The first shovelful of earth was placed on Michael's casket, a moment that should have had our full attention and reverence. Instead, the sound of approaching sirens intruded on our final farewell. A police cruiser pulled up to the cemetery entrance, and an officer I recognized immediately stepped out. Officer James Reynolds had worked with my office on several cases. He was a good cop with a solid reputation for fairness. As he approached, Sandra Winters rushed to intercept him, gesturing animatedly toward us. The minister finished the service quietly as Officer Reynolds listened to Sandra's complaints. I could see from his expression that he was trying to make sense of being called to a funeral for a trespassing complaint. When the service concluded, he approached our group respectfully, removing his hat. "Mr. Attorney General," he said quietly, acknowledging my position with a slight nod, "I am very sorry about your son." Sandra Winters, who had followed closely behind Officer Reynolds, froze momentarily. "Attorney General," she repeated, her confident demeanor faltering slightly. Officer Reynolds turned to her. "Yes, ma'am, Mr. Thompson is our state's Attorney General." He returned his attention to me. "Sir, I apologize for the intrusion on your family's time of mourning. There seems to be some confusion about property boundaries." "There is no confusion," Sandra insisted, recovering quickly. "Our HOA documents clearly show." "Ma'am," Officer Reynolds interrupted gently but firmly, "I have already spoken with the cemetery caretaker while you were giving your statement. He has confirmed that all of this land, including the oak trees along the eastern edge, is deeded cemetery property. The actual boundary line is the stone wall 20 yards beyond that furthest tree." Sandra's face flushed. "That cannot be right. Our HOA has been maintaining." "The cemetery has documentation dating back to its founding," Officer Reynolds continued. "If there is a legitimate property dispute, it would need to be addressed through proper legal channels, not by confronting mourners during a burial service." I thanked Officer Reynolds, then turned to the gathered family members and friends. "Thank you all for coming today to honor Michael. Please join us at our home for a small reception." As people began to disperse, I noticed Marcus standing alone by Michael's grave, his expression devastated in a new way. I went to him, placing my hand on his shoulder. "I am so sorry this happened today, son." He looked up at me, his eyes red. "I ruined it, Dad. Michael's funeral. I ruined it by causing a scene." "No," I said firmly. "You did nothing wrong. You needed a moment with your grief, which is the most natural thing in the world. What happened after was not your fault." As we walked back to our car, I glanced back to see Sandra Winters still arguing with Officer Reynolds, her face flushed with indignation. Something about the entire incident nagged at me, not just the appalling lack of human decency, but a sense that this was not an isolated occurrence. The days following Michael's funeral passed in a fog of grief and necessary routines. Marcus returned to his apartment near the university but called daily, his voice still hollow with loss. I went through the motions at work, grateful for colleagues who shouldered extra burdens without complaint. But at night, alone in my house now emptier than it had ever been, my thoughts returned repeatedly to the cemetery incident. One evening, unable to sleep, I found myself searching online for Oak Ridge Estate's HOA complaints. What I discovered was illuminating. The search returned dozens of results, community forum posts, local news articles, and even a dedicated Facebook group titled Oak Ridge HOA Victims. Sandra Winters featured prominently in many of the complaints, described variously as power-hungry, vindictive, and relentless in pursuit of rule enforcement. My professional interest was piqued. As Attorney General, I had prosecuted cases involving HOA fraud and overreach before, but this seemed different, more personal, more systematic. I dug deeper, requesting cemetery records the next day. The cemetery manager, still apologetic about the funeral incident, provided me with documents showing numerous complaints against Oak Ridge HOA for harassment of cemetery visitors. "It has been going on for years," he explained. "They claim different portions of our land as theirs, depending on the day. We have sent multiple cease and desist letters, but Ms. Winters simply ignores them." Most disturbing was his next revelation. Some visitors have received what look like official fines on HOA letterhead for trespassing or unauthorized use of HOA facilities. Several elderly visitors paid these fines, not realizing they were completely fraudulent. I examined the sample violation notice he showed me. It was designed to intimidate, with official-looking seals and threatening language about liens and legal action if not paid promptly. The document directed recipients to mail payments directly to a P.O. box rather than the HOA's official address, a classic sign of embezzlement. "Do you have security cameras on the grounds?" I asked. "We installed them last year after repeatedly finding our no trespassing signs removed from the boundary areas," he replied, bringing up footage on his computer. "Here's one incident from about 3 months ago." The video clearly showed Sandra Winters removing cemetery-placed boundary markers and replacing them with her own signs several yards inside cemetery property. Another clip showed her approaching an elderly woman sitting on a bench near a grave, gesturing angrily until the visitor left in apparent distress. "May I have copies of these records?" I asked, my attorney's mind already organizing the evidence into potential charges. That evening, I received an unexpected message, a sympathy card from Officer Reynolds with a handwritten note. "Mr. Thompson, I wanted to express my condolences again for your loss. What happened at your son's funeral was unconscionable. This is not the first incident I've responded to involving Ms. Winters and the Oak Ridge HOA. If I can assist in any way, please don't hesitate to call." He included his personal number. I sat at my desk, the scattered evidence before me telling a story of systematic harassment, fraudulent representations of authority, and possibly financial fraud. As Attorney General, I could launch an official investigation immediately. But as a grieving father whose son's funeral had been disrupted, I needed to be cautious about any appearance of using my position for personal vengeance. The next morning, I met with my chief deputy, Elena Rodriguez, a brilliant attorney whose judgment I trusted implicitly. "I need your honest assessment," I said after explaining the situation and showing her the evidence. "Is this worth pursuing officially, or am I too close to this because of what happened at Michael's funeral?" Elena reviewed the documents carefully. "With respect, sir, these are serious violations regardless of your personal connection. The fraudulent fines alone constitute mail fraud. The false claims of property ownership, harassment of cemetery visitors, and potential embezzlement of fraudulently collected funds would warrant investigation even if you had never encountered this woman." "You are right," I acknowledged. "But I need to be above reproach in how we handle this. I would like you to take lead officially with me advising. We will document everything meticulously and proceed by the book." Over the next 2 weeks, we built our case methodically. We interviewed cemetery visitors who had been harassed, collected statements from cemetery staff, and subpoenaed the HOA's financial records. We discovered the P.O. box for violation payments was registered solely to Sandra Winters, not the HOA, and bank records showed these funds had never been recorded in official HOA accounts. Most tellingly, when we spoke with other HOA board members, several expressed surprise about the cemetery boundary disputes. "We voted 2 years ago to accept the cemetery's historical boundary documentation," one board member told us. "Sandra was supposed to communicate that to the cemetery management and stop any enforcement actions along that border." Meanwhile, Marcus continued to struggle with both grief and the trauma from the funeral incident. During one of our dinner conversations, he admitted, "I cannot bring myself to visit Michael's grave. Every time I think about going back to the cemetery, I remember that woman and how she made me feel, like I did not even have the right to grieve my own brother." His words crystallized something for me. This was not just about legal violations or abuse of power. It was about the human cost of such behavior. How many others had been denied the basic dignity of mourning their loved ones in peace? "I think it is time we address this situation directly," I told Elena the next day. "Not just with legal filings, but with a face-to-face confrontation that gives these HOA board members a chance to correct course before we escalate to formal charges." We arranged an emergency meeting with the Oak Ridge Estates HOA board, requesting through official channels that all members be present to discuss urgent legal matters affecting the association. We deliberately did not specify the nature of the concerns or identify ourselves beyond our connection to the State Attorney General's office. On the evening of the meeting, I arrived with Alina and Officer Reynolds, who had agreed to attend in his official capacity. We waited in the community center meeting room as board members filtered in, their expressions curious and slightly concerned. Sandra Winters arrived last, her confident stride faltering slightly when she spotted me sitting at the head of their boardroom table. "What is this about?" she demanded, looking around at her fellow board members. "Why is he here?" I stood, presenting my credentials formally. "Good evening. I am Attorney General Richard Thompson. This is Chief Deputy Attorney General Alina Rodriguez and Officer James Reynolds. We are here to address serious legal violations committed by the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, particularly regarding cemetery boundary disputes and fraudulent fines." The blood drained from Sandra's face as she recognized not just me, but the full weight of my office now aligned against her. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "We have documentation." "Ms. Winters," Alina interrupted smoothly, "we have copies of the actual property deeds, historical boundary surveys, and your own HOA board minutes indicating that you were instructed to cease all enforcement actions against cemetery visitors over 2 years ago." The other board members turned to stare at Sandra, confusion and alarm spreading across their faces. "That is not," Sandra began. "We also have evidence," I continued, "of fraudulent fines issued to cemetery visitors, directing payment to a private P.O. box registered solely in your name, with no record of these funds in HOA financial statements." One of the board members, an older gentleman, leaned forward. "What fines? The board never authorized any fines for cemetery visitors." Alina distributed copies of the violation notices we had collected. These were presented as official HOA communications, but the payment address does not match your association's official records. "I have never seen these before," another board member said, examining the document with growing horror. "This is not our letterhead or our standard notice format." Sandra remained standing, her composure cracking. "This is all a misunderstanding. As HOA president, I have certain discretionary authorities to protect our community's interests." "You have no authority to harass grieving families," I stated, my professional demeanor momentarily slipping. "You have no authority to issue fraudulent fines, and you certainly had no authority to call the police on my son while we were burying his brother." A shocked silence fell over the room. "That was your son's funeral?" one of the female board members asked, her hand covering her mouth. "Sandra told us she called the police on drunken trespassers damaging HOA property that day." Officer Reynolds cleared his throat. "When I responded to that call, I found a funeral in progress and a young man grieving by a tree well within cemetery boundaries. There was no damage, no drunkenness, and no trespassing." The board members exchanged horrified glances. The older gentleman who had spoken earlier turned to Sandra. "You told us you were working cooperatively with the cemetery on boundary issues. You said the property line disputes had been resolved amicably." "I was protecting our property values," Sandra insisted, her voice rising. "Those cemetery people bring down the whole neighborhood with their constant coming and going, parking on our streets." "Those cemetery people," I interrupted coldly, "are human beings mourning their loved ones, and the streets you reference are public roads, not HOA property." Alina opened her briefcase and removed a document. "The Oak Ridge Estates HOA is now facing potential charges including mail fraud, harassment, fraudulent misrepresentation of authority, and possibly embezzlement, depending on what our forensic accountants find regarding those collected fines." She placed the document on the table. "However, we are prepared to focus our investigation on individual actors rather than the association as a whole, provided there is full cooperation from the board." The implications were clear. The board members looked at the document, then at Sandra, whose face had gone from pale to mottled red. "This is persecution," she hissed. "You are only doing this because of what happened at your son's funeral. You are abusing your position for personal revenge. I had anticipated this accusation and was prepared. Every allegation we have presented predates my personal experience with Ms. Winters. The fraudulent fines, boundary harassment, and misrepresentation began at least 2 years ago, according to our evidence. My office would have investigated these complaints regardless of who submitted them. The board chairman, who had been silent until now, spoke up. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Attorney General? Full cooperation with our investigation, Alina replied promptly. Complete financial transparency, immediate cessation of all harassment of cemetery visitors, and the resignation of Ms. Winters from the board, effective immediately. You cannot remove me, Sandra protested. Only the members can vote me out. Actually, the chairman said slowly, according to our bylaws, the board can remove an officer for cause with a 2/3 vote. He looked around at his fellow board members. I believe fraud and misrepresentation of authority constitute cause. What followed was almost painful to watch. One by one, board members began sharing their own concerns about Sandra's leadership. Reports they had dismissed, complaints they had minimized, financial questions that had been deflected. It became clear that her intimidating personality had kept many issues from being properly addressed. There was that incident with the Miller family's fence, one member said. Sandra insisted it violated HOA rules, but when I checked the actual bylaws, their design was perfectly compliant. And the special assessment for the entrance landscaping, another added. We approved $15,000, but the final bill was over $25,000, and Sandra said it was too late to contest the charges. As the meeting continued, Sandra Winters's empire of intimidation crumbled. The board voted unanimously to remove her as president and cooperate fully with our investigation. She stormed out, threatening lawsuits against everyone present, but her threats rang hollow in the face of the evidence. In the weeks that followed, our investigation uncovered the full extent of the HOA abuses. Sandra Winters was charged with multiple counts of fraud, with additional charges pending based on financial forensics. The HOA, under new leadership, implemented strict transparency measures and formal boundary agreements with the cemetery. Most meaningful to me personally was the healing I witnessed in Marcus. When I told him about the outcome of our investigation, something shifted in his expression, a small release of the tension he had carried since the funeral. I would like to visit Michael's grave, he said quietly. Would you come with me? On a clear Sunday afternoon, we returned to Riverside Cemetery. The grounds were peaceful, with no sign of property disputes or harassment. As we approached Michael's grave, I noticed something unexpected. A small garden had been planted near the oak tree where Marcus had sought solace that terrible day. A simple plaque explained, "This memorial garden is dedicated to those who grieve and those they have lost. May this space provide peace and dignity to all who visit." Established by the Oak Ridge Estates Community Association in cooperation with Riverside Cemetery. Marcus knelt beside his brother's headstone, tracing the engraved name with his fingertips. I have so much to tell you, Michael, he whispered. I stepped back, giving him privacy for this moment of connection. As I waited, I noticed an elderly couple placing flowers at a nearby grave. They moved without hurry or apprehension, their grief undisturbed by false claims or petty harassment. That was when I understood the true value of what we had accomplished. My professional position, which had seemed so meaningless in the face of losing Michael, had become the means to protect something sacred, the right to mourn in peace, to honor those we have lost without interference or indignity. 6 months later, I attended the dedication of what had become known as the Dignity Garden at Riverside Cemetery. The ceremony was attended by cemetery staff, Oak Ridge residents, and families who had experienced harassment in the past. The new HOA board had worked with the cemetery to not only clarify boundaries, but to establish a cooperative relationship, with association volunteers now helping to maintain the public areas of the grounds. Marcus stood beside me, more at peace than I had seen him since before Michael's death. He had started a support group for siblings dealing with unexpected loss, finding purpose in helping others navigate the path he was walking. "Dad," he said as we walked back to our car after the ceremony, "I think Michael would approve of how this all turned out. Not just the justice part, but the healing part." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. He always did believe in finding the greater good, even in the worst situations. The following spring, on the anniversary of Michael's death, I visited his grave alone. The Dignity Garden was in full bloom, a quiet haven for reflection and remembrance. I sat on a bench beneath the oak tree, that same tree where Marcus had sought a moment of peace, unwittingly setting in motion such significant change. "You know, Michael," I said softly, "when I lost you, I thought nothing made sense anymore. Not my work, not the law, not the systems I had dedicated my life to upholding. But somehow, through all of this, I found a way to use those same systems to protect something that matters deeply, the sacred space of grief." A gentle breeze stirred the oak leaves above me, and for a moment I felt a profound sense of connection. To Michael, to Marcus, to every person who had found peace in this place because of the changes we had made. "Your memory lives on, son," I whispered. "Not just in our hearts, but in the protection and dignity that others can now find in their darkest moments." As I walked back through the cemetery gates, I passed a family entering, parents with 2 young children carrying flowers. They moved with the solemn purpose of those on a mission of remembrance, but also with the security of knowing they would be respected in their grief. In their faces, I saw the living legacy of my son, protection, dignity, and peace for others in their most vulnerable moments.